Hello, ladies, and welcome back after half term. Hope you had a good rest, such as it might have been. We're going to be looking at demand side policies as the next narrated PowerPoint. So this is basically chapter 13. This is actually quite a long presentation. There's about nearly 50 slides. So I'm suggesting that this is probably going to be sufficient for you to look at over the next couple of lessons. So I'm going to do it as one set of slides, and we'll take it from there. So, but I'm assuming there's probably two lessons, maybe even a bit more than 2 lessons worth of content here. So let's get cracking. So we're going to look at a number of things, and some of it we will have covered previously in some of the year 1 work, but specifically we're going to be looking at demand side policies, which is going to cover the following. So we're going to make a distinction between monetary and fiscal policy. We're obviously going to define some of those terms too. Fiscal policy is basically government spending and taxation, both direct and indirect, and we'll look at some of the tools and some of the ways in which the government can use fiscal policy to help achieve macroeconomic objectives. We're also going to look at monetary policy, what the role of the Bank of England is, and also the Monetary Policy Committee. We're also going to consider interest rates, which clearly is going to be one of the fundamental things that's used in terms of controlling the money supply, and so is a fundamental part of monetary policy. We're also going to look at something known as quantitative easing, which some of you will be familiar with, and that's basically where the Bank of England uses some of the money that it creates to buy asset purchases, and then so increase the money supply. So once we've looked at the distinction between the two, we're also going to look at how changing the level of aggregate demand on the economy as a whole can be impacted by both fiscal and monetary policy. One of the things you also need to be able to do is to demonstrate how those changes might affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and that's quite a nice way to illustrate demand side policies, as we'll see. Clearly, dependent on the type of fiscal policy and or monetary policy that's being used, that clearly is going to have an impact on investment, job creation, and economic growth, and how that can be encouraged by using fiscal and monetary policy in different ways. We'll also look at how inflation and unemployment can be controlled, and also one of the key things is that when we're talking about these macroeconomic objectives that we're trying to achieve and the tools that we've got available, there is always going to be some sort of time lag between the implementation of the policy and actually that having an effect. And then we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of demand side policies. And finally, look at some of the policies and how, in some cases, the macroeconomic objectives that the government sets for itself, sometimes there are trade-offs between the policies themselves and also the objectives that the government is trying to achieve through its various different policies. Okay, so let's look at demand side policies first then. And a lot of this is a recap from some of the year 1 content, but let's just run through it quickly. So, distinction between monetary and fiscal policy. We're going to look at some monetary policy instruments in the first instance. Okay, so when we're talking about monetary policy in particular, we're going to be talking about interest rates and the manipulation of interest rates to control the money supply. The other alternative, and it's another form of monetary policy, is quantitative easing, and we'll go into that in quite a bit of detail. Slightly difficult to explain, but fundamentally it's by what the government and its various different economic agents are doing is basically looking at increasing the amount of money that's available, and that obviously then has an impact on economic growth and investment, etc. So then we're going to look at some fiscal policy instruments. Okay, so government spending and taxation. Basically, any fiscal policy is the way in which government chooses to spend and or tax, and there are a number of different options that they can choose from. Then we're going to look at the difference between the government budget deficit and surplus, and it is where we're talking about the fiscal deficit and potentially a fiscal surplus, and that's the difference between the amount of money raised in taxation and the amount that the government chooses to spend. So if it chooses to spend more than it raised in taxation, then there is a budget deficit, a fiscal budget deficit. If it chooses to spend less than it raises in taxation, then there would be a budget surplus, okay, fiscal budget surplus. We'll also look at different forms of taxation, both direct and indirect, and then use the use of AD and AS diagrams to illustrate these, as we talked about before. We'll look at the role of the Bank of England, and specifically what the Bank of England is responsible for and what the Monetary Policy Committee does. Some of you are probably aware of that, but also looking at some of the demand side policies and how they have actually affected the way in which different policies have had an effect on where there's been a significant external shock, like the Great Depression or the global financial crisis, and how those policies have been used and also interpreted to help, hopefully, solve economic problems. And then finally, we'll look at the strengths and weaknesses of demand side policies. Okay, so let's move on and take a look at fiscal policy specifically then. So what is it? It's basically, as it states there, the manipulation of government spending, taxation, and government borrowing to influence the level of economic activity. So remember, whenever you've got fiscal policy, it's government spending and taxation. Okay, those are the two things that the government has available within its fiscal policy armory to influence the level of economic activity. So let's take a look at some fiscal policy goals then, and how those goals are achieved through different means of different policies, I suppose. So effectively, with the fiscal policy that's being used is going to be trying to achieve a wide variety of objectives. And as a result of that, in some cases, it's not necessarily always possible to satisfy all of the objectives. So one thing might be, well, we know that the government has a target of keeping inflation under control, and that is 2%, the 2% target that we talked about on numerous occasions, and it can, to some degree, help to influence that through some of its fiscal policy goals. Okay, now we could argue that inflation generally is controlled by monetary policy, but there are means by which the government, if it's using both fiscal and monetary policy, and possibly supply side policy, it can use that to help to achieve the overall macroeconomic objective of keeping inflation below 2%. It can be used, obviously, to stimulate economic growth and employment during times of recession. So if we've got an economy that's in recession, we've had two periods of negative economic growth, then clearly fiscal policy can be used to stimulate economic growth and development. Also, and remember that we talked about this principle of stability, trying to achieve stability. So we're trying to minimise the booms and busts of the economic cycle, and that again can be fiscal spending can be used, and taxation can be used to try and maintain a stable environment for individuals and businesses to thrive within. However, one of the things that we have to bear in mind as well is that fiscal policy in some cases can have supply side effects too. And any change in the balance between government spending and taxation is clearly going to have an impact on those three macroeconomic objectives and targets. However, as we've said before, no man is an island, and in some cases fiscal policy can also have an effect on microeconomic targets, okay, and that could be improving education, health, and the redistribution of income, and obviously that has an impact. If education improves and training improves, then that has an impact on the human capital that firms can employ, and so there is a whole range of benefits that can be gained from decent fiscal policy. So let's have a look at some of the instruments that can be used then, and let's just break that down a wee bit. Okay, so clearly there are a number of different options in terms of the choice of fiscal policy. So we might choose to be expansionary in our fiscal policy, and that's where the government would be essentially trying to produce some positive economic activity and to stimulate that. Things that they can use to help that, to expand the economy, would be to cut taxes. Clearly, if we have a cut in income tax, that means that that consumers have more disposable income, and they are more likely then to use some of that disposable income to raise consumption. So clearly, that would be a good way of stimulating some economic activity. If we cut corporation tax, so that's the amount of tax that businesses pay on the profits that they make, then clearly that should stimulate firms to number one, well, they'll keep more of their profit, and that should stimulate investment, which again should lead to greater economic activity. Other ways in which we could use expansionary fiscal policy would be for the government to raise the level of spending. So it might choose to spend it on core infrastructure projects or increase the pay of public sector workers. Well, clearly, in that case, that would again should have a positive economic advantage, I suppose. Now, other things that they could do, again, this is open to the government if they choose to. They might choose to increase the budget deficit. Now, you might think budget deficit normally sounds a negative thing, doesn't it? But in this instance, if you think about it, if we increase the budget deficit, that's basically another way of increasing spending. So effectively, what would happen is the government would actually choose to spend more than it's raised in taxation. And obviously, in that case, it would increase its own borrowing, and that clearly would imply that if the government was spending more than it was raising in taxation, that would be an expansionary economic activity. A lot can be spent on a number of different projects nationally, but also bear in mind that if we are increasing the borrowing that the government is making, then that can actually add to the overall national debt. And at some stage, that clearly has to be repaid with interest, okay? So remember, the difference between a deficit and the national debt is that a budget deficit or a budget surplus from one year to the next is basically, as it says, contained within that year. But if we have a number of different years where we have a deficit, then we add those deficits together to create the national debt. So the national debt is the overall amount of government borrowing that's gone on over a period of years. And obviously that does have to be paid back at some stage. Let's go into these in a bit more detail then. So we talked about expansionary fiscal policy. We're now going to look at contractionary fiscal policy, and that's where effectively the government is trying to constrain or reduce aggregate demand, or to reduce debt, or to control inflation. So there's a whole range of reasons why the government might choose to use contractionary fiscal policy, as mentioned there. Okay, some of the methods that can be used, that we're using the same things essentially. Effectively, we're using government spending and taxation. In this case, if we increase tax, so if we increase income tax, that's going to mean that we're going to discourage spending, and that's potentially going to then reduce consumption. That would then reduce aggregate demand, and that may help to bring inflation under control. As there's less demand for goods and services, that might actually reduce the pressure on prices to go up. Other ways in which we can be contractionary in our fiscal policy would be to cut government spending. Okay, so might choose to reduce the amount of expenditure on public projects, or to cut key government budgets, particularly if the government spending previously was considered to be unaffordable, or possibly even creating inflationary pressures. So again, that would be a justifiable reason for cutting government spending. Could also be looking to cut the budget deficit. Okay, so we know we've got a large budget deficit, and the national debt is a significant amount of money that is going up year by year. And clearly, at some stage, that's one of the things that the government will have to consider. And in some cases, reducing the budget deficit would be a reason for reducing the amount of government spending that was going on. That might actually, when we think about it, if we cut the long-term borrowing commitments of the government, that could help to stabilise economic growth, as we'd have reduced debt repayments, and those could be, instead of being spent on interest on the loans that the government has taken out, we might be able to reinvest that back into the economy. And we're going to take a look at how these can be demonstrated in a diagrammatic form now. Okay, we're going to look at both expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy, and hopefully this will be reasonably familiar to you. Okay, let's take a look at this first one now. I'm just going to move me over here a bit so we can actually see exactly what's going on the chart. So this is expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so we've got our Keynesian LRAS curve, so long run aggregate supply, and we've got our aggregate demand curve drawn in. Remember, always label your axes. So we've got price level against real national output, and at this point, our aggregate demand line is crossing our long run aggregate supply curve at Y. So our real national output at the level of equilibrium, national equilibrium, would be Y, and our price would be P. Okay, so let's assume in this case that the government would like to stimulate some economic growth. What would happen would be it might choose to, in order to do that, to cut taxation. And if we cut taxation, that's going to be a boost to aggregate demand, because if we cut that, that's going to mean that more people will have more money in their pockets, and then essentially we're going to have a rise in aggregate demand. So our aggregate demand curve will shift out to the right and go upwards, and that has an effect, as we can see, of raising national output to Y1. So our new equilibrium point is Y1. And obviously that is going to mean that we have more output, so that's going to mean that the economy will expand. Okay, and that clearly also, there's an added benefit to that, is that if we've got greater demand in the economy, then that could mean that we're going to get greater employment. So firms will have to produce more goods, and they may well have to then employ more people, which is obviously good for the workforce, and obviously indirectly the level of tax that's going to be raised by the government with more people in work. However, as with all of these things, if we're going to try to expand the economy, there is a potential danger that if we do that too much, then there is a danger that our price levels are going to increase. As we can see here, we can see that the price level has moved from aggregate demand to AD1, and so we've now got national output at Y1, and our price level has increased. So there is going to be some inflationary pressure as a result of that expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, if we consider that then as well, that another impact or implication for that is that if we have this additional consumption that's been created by a reduction in tax, generally speaking, if we get higher levels of consumption, we tend to have a high propensity to spend any additional consumption on imports, and that clearly then is also going to have an impact on the balance of payments on the current account, in that we're going to be spending more on imports, and that then is going to mean that when we calculate our current account for the balance of payments, that's going to cause a worse position. Okay, let's take a look then at, in this case, how expansionary fiscal policies might choose to be used that might also stimulate the supply side of the economy. Okay, so obviously we can't necessarily just say fiscal is the best way of going about things, and or supply and or monetary. Generally speaking, it's going to be a combination of all three, and the government will try to consider each one in order to try to best achieve the objectives that they're trying to get to. So in this case then, we're assuming that the government would like to stimulate the supply side of the economy. And in order to do that, they might choose to cut corporation tax in order to boost firms' profits. which can then be reinvested in capital projects. Now, clearly, if they do that, that's going to be a reduction in the costs for businesses, and effectively that's going to cause long run aggregate supply to shift to the right. So effectively that's going to mean that as more businesses earn more profits, they can reinvest those into capital projects, and there should be a shift in long run aggregate supply. It will move from LRAS to LRAS1 as shown in the diagram. That means effectively two things. One is that productive capacity is now increased, as you can see from our original point of FE at this point, okay, full employment for our longer and aggregate supply. That's now moved to so that our overall productive capacity is significantly increased to FE1. And also, on the basis of that, you can see there's a fall in the price level from P to P1, as you can see. Okay, so effectively, aggregate demand has stayed at the set. Well, has not changed as such at this point, but P1, our price, and also the level of demand has also shifted, and that's hopefully going to then, due to that extra productive capacity, help to soften any inflationary pressures. But one thing we have to have to bear in mind is that if we just this basic principle happens and this area of the economy changes, okay, so if our aggregate demand remains unchanged, well, the spare capacity that has created by moving from Y to YFE to YFE1, Y1 and FE1, okay, indicates that there is a significant waste of economic resources, because at the moment the demand isn't sufficient to satisfy the new level of supply. Okay, so again, it's about a delicate balancing act with any of these policies that the government is trying to introduce. Let's look at contractionary fiscal policy now then. So this is where the government might choose to use fiscal policy and contracting the economy to some degree to try to help achieve its 2% inflation target, because in this case maybe the economy is running up against capacity constraints. So it might choose to increase taxation, okay, and that would mean that we'd get a cut in AD from AD to AD1 as consumption falls. So an increase in taxation would mean that we'd have less money in our pockets to spend on consumption, and hence aggregate demand would fall. Okay, that effectively would reduce inflationary pressures, because as you can see in that scenario, our new equilibrium point at Y1 is also at price level 1. So there's been a reduction in inflationary pressure as the price level has fallen at that new level of demand. We could also argue there's added benefits because that improves the balance of payment on the current account, as less income would be spent on imports as consumption falls. But the danger is that if we actually allow that to happen and let that go for too long, then if we get a reduction in the real national output, then that could potentially damage economic growth. And clearly, if economic growth starts to falter, then businesses might choose to actually not employ quite so many people because they can't see the demand that they need to sustain their business. And clearly, in that scenario, that could then lead to increased cyclical unemployment caused by that falling consumption and lower aggregate demand. Okay, let's have a look at some strengths and weaknesses of fiscal policy. Then I'm going to move myself again over here, because I think you should be able to see all that's going on easily on the slide without me being up in the corner there. Okay, so economic growth. Clearly, one of the issues we've got to think about is that expansionary policy won't necessarily increase long-run growth rates, but it should definitely help to achieve it in the short run. Okay, so it will definitely act as a short-run stimulus to economic growth. But if we're thinking about tax cuts and increased government spending, that might also help to lift the country out of recession. Okay, so that could smooth out any fluctuations in the economic cycle. So there's clearly some good reasons for considering fiscal policy as a powerful policy. So one of the issues that also we need to bear in mind is that the Keynesian view is very much that increasing government budget deficits in the short run can actually help to achieve economic growth. Remember, if we're going to increase the budget deficit, that means we're going to spend more than we've gained in taxes. So in some cases, that could be seen as a legitimate policy in order to stimulate economic growth. If we take a look at unemployment then, okay, there are a couple that we can consider. Let's go back one, sorry, I'm one too many. So clearly, if we've got high levels of government spending, that should lead to high levels of employment. And in that case, obviously, we should hopefully have decent training programs and decent work schemes to actually help that whole process. So effectively, if we can improve employment stats, that's clearly going to be a really important thing to consider. And obviously, the other thing that can be used is tax credits and welfare changes, and those clearly can help to achieve the level of employment figures that we're looking for. Other areas that we can take a look at then, the strengths and weaknesses of fiscal policy. When we're talking about inflation, one of the issues with inflation, although to some degree fiscal policy can be used, is it's quite difficult to apply the pressure that we need to on prices by fiscal policy. It's considered to be a fairly blunt instrument when we seek to control price levels. Now, in theory, when we think about it and the way we described it previously, if we've got expansionary policies that should boost aggregate demand, that's going to create inflationary pressures, whereas contractionary policy, where we're reducing the level of demand, should do the opposite. But like we said, quite a blunt instrument and takes quite some time for that to work its way through. As we mentioned there, it's very delicate, but very difficult to fine-tune some of these policies because taxation and government spending tend to be quite long-term policies. Again, in some cases, the stuff that we're trying to influence can't really be influenced using fiscal policy just by itself. So, for instance, an increase in raw materials from abroad is not something that we're going to be able to control necessarily directly or in a very timely fashion using fiscal policy. Balance and payments on the current account we talked about previously. Okay, we tend to, as a country, have a very high propensity to import. And so any expansionary policy that the government might choose to try to apply is going to limit our ability to achieve this overall target, because that's going to mean that as we get more expansion in the economy, we're going to have high levels of imports, and that's then going to have an significant impact on the balance of payments current account. However, in some cases, the government might choose to employ expenditure switching policies like taxing foreign imports to make domestic goods more attractive, and that clearly can be a policy that's used to try to influence that particular macroeconomic objective that the government might set for itself. Okay, let's have a look at taxation then. So we talked about spending. Let's have a look at different types of taxation, and there are some videos for you to take a look at, and some of the links that you can clearly go and take a look at too. I'll just move myself again over here so you can see all of the links. So let's take a look at taxation then. Okay, we've got direct tax, which is that's imposed on the incomes of individuals or profits of businesses, and that includes any type of tax that's paid directly to the government. Some of these are going to include the following. We've got income tax. I think I'm going to sneeze in a minute. If I do, I'll try and warn you. So we've got income tax, then we've got corporation tax, then we've got inheritance tax, national insurance contributions. Okay, so each one of those is a direct tax. So income tax is that money that's paid by employees. It's taken at source and it goes direct to the government. Corporation tax is that businesses pay on their profits. and that at the moment I think is running at 19% of all the profits that a business makes goes to the government in the form of corporation tax. Inheritance tax is to do with the amount of money that you inherit, and there are a number of different systems that are in place. And again, that money, any money that's inherited by you has a number of different stipulations. You're allowed to take a certain amount tax free, but anything over and above a certain level is taxed at 40%. And that goes to the government. Okay, national insurance contributions again are things that are paid at source. So anybody that's an employee pays national insurance contributions, and that's a percentage of their salary that goes each month. Let's take a look at some indirect taxes then. Okay, so these are where those that are imposed on goods or services. So it's basically a tax on spending in essence. Okay, so they tend to increase the price of a good or a service, and they include things like value-added tax, VAT, excise duty, and customs duty. So, and they all add to the price of the good or service that you are buying. So it's essentially a tax on spending, if you like. Let's have a look at the strengths and weaknesses then. Is fiscal policy particularly effective? Very much depends on a number of things. Obviously, the size and change in the government spending or taxation will have an impact, and obviously it will vary on the size of that change. More often than not, the effectiveness, efficiency, and timing of the changes will also influence policy effectiveness, and also a coordinated approach so that we get fiscal policy, monetary policy, and supply side policy working hand in hand to try to achieve the overall objectives. Clearly, if we're talking about any sort of government spending and or taxation, then the effect on the size of the multiplier is clearly going to influence the size of the changes in aggregate demand. So we talked about the multiplier effect in the last chapter, and obviously the higher the level of multiplier, the greater the influence in terms of the change in AD that any government spending or taxation might change in either of those might have. Another thing that will clearly have an effect is how close to full employment the economy is. If there's not a great deal of room for extra capacity, then the argument is that we have a change in government spending, an increase in government spending in this instance, let's say, then that's all that's going to really do is fuel inflation rather than anything else, because there's no room for extra capacity. So as we mentioned there, okay, that obviously has an effect. And obviously the time, one of the big principles and big things to remember with any of these changes in tax cuts or spending, it's going to have some time. It's not going to happen instantly. So the impact of these measures is always going to be a time lag between the policy announcement and that policy actually having any sort of effect. So multiple choice questions for you to answer, and have a go at each one of those. It's sort of testing your understanding on what we've covered so far, and we can run through the answers to that when we talk together online. Okay. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 questions that you can take a look at, and that's just hopefully a means of actually checking your understanding as we've been going through this. Let's take a look at the different sources of tax revenue then. Income tax, as you can see in terms of our graphic here, is this was based on 2015-16 figures. Significantly the greatest amount of income is generated by income tax. Okay, then VAT follows, national insurance contributions, etc., etc. Okay, so we can see how important that getting the income tax levels right and also communicated clearly to everybody is going to have a fundamental effect. And obviously, if you start to make changes in the level of income tax, that then has a huge implication on the level of tax revenue that is going to be achieved. And the amount of spending that the government might be able to put in place as a result of those changes in tax. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. I think I said I was going to do one whole presentation. I think I'm probably going to stop there. So we've covered fiscal policy, and then we'll move on and look at monetary policy in a supplementary presentation. Okay, so I'll do that immediately after this, but we'll split it into two. I think it's going to be a little bit more manageable that way. Okay, so thank you for listening, and we'll come back shortly talking about monetary policy as another way of influencing demand side policies.